So, I'm at this studio space today, and lo and behold, when I thought it would be a great day to record in the main room, there are movie auditions going on. So, I gotta be in the booth today, which is okay because it's very focused and it's very, you know. I've been thinking a lot about how sometimes it's confusing to know what you might need in a computer when it comes to media creation. Now, I mean, the obvious logic might be go all out and get everything that's the best, but that's not always what you need depending on the type of work that you do. Now, there's plenty of videos on gaming and what type of parts you might need for gaming and graphics cards and things like that. There's plenty of that, but none that I could find really isolate the type of components you might need for various aspects of media creation and which things you should be focused on as opposed to others. So that's what this video is going to do. I'm going to be talking about video editing, Photoshop and Lightroom, and 3D modeling, since they all kind of need different things to be able to do your work well. And I have two different categories for video editing because there are different types of workloads that you might be dealing with and different tiers of scaled quality for those parts. So it might be a little bit of a longer video, but trust me, it's going to be worth it and kind of educational about why this is the way that it is. So down below, I'm going to have a list of the parts that I'm talking about that might help you with your computer needs. Now, I've made it so that all the rules kind of apply to laptops as well. If you are the person that needs to work on a laptop, it's a little bit different because laptops tend to have slightly different performances in their parts because they deal more with mobile versions that are less power hungry. Because a desktop computer could use, 300, 500 or more watts out of the wall, whereas a laptop is dealing with a cell, a battery that can only output so much power and only output so much power for so long. So they have to dumb down some of their stuff, and to be able to get efficient workloads out of these machines, they have to spend a lot of engineering time. So a lot of times the ones that are closer to desktop performances are a lot more expensive. But if you have to take your work on the go with you, then sometimes that's your only option. So the rules still apply. It's still parts to look for in those machines, should you be looking for those. But anyway, I just thought I'd preface it with that. So the first category we're going to be looking at today is HD video editing. Now, for a machine to edit HD video, you can start with a quad-core processor, that's fine. But we're going to be dealing with ideals here, things that you kind of want to aim for or get as close as possible to. Now, the very minimum, yeah, you can do even dual core if you need to, but you will get hindered performances, especially in Premiere, if you're not doing 4 or more. Ideally, you're going to want 6 or 8 cores at the highest clocked speeds that you can. Now, where it's really going to come into play for your CPU is the rendering time once you've completed your video. Now, I'm going to be talking about specifically Premiere because that's what I'm most familiar with. There are plenty of other video editing softwares out there that can be good. Your mileage will vary, but I think the industry standard Adobe Premiere is what I'll be referring to. So, the video rendering, the encoding that happens at the end can take a long time. The less cores, the less higher the frequencies are that they're working with. Some of that is GPU accelerated, but in the end, it still always falls back on your CPU. In fact, there have been some tests that show that pretty much anything after like a GTX 1050 Ti, there's not going to be much of a difference when encoding comparatively to each other as opposed to the CPU itself. So yes, graphics cards will accelerate the process, but when it comes to the encoding, that's not going to be really reliant on your graphics card. Now, the GPU will help a little bit while you're working with your project live, but still CPU is what you're going to focus on. So by today's standards, I'd recommend, at least a 1650 Super, perhaps, because the Super variants have the GDDR6 memory, which is a lot faster than GDDR5. That is the only difference. You can go up in graphics cards if you do other things like 3D modeling, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But really, you're not going to need much as far as video cards. Put that money all into your CPU and your RAM, because the RAM is going to be super heavily utilized, especially with bigger projects. Now, when dealing with HD, you can kind of get away with 8 gigabytes if your projects are small, but even in HD, you're going to need 16 gigabytes at least. Even with 10 to 15 minute videos, just if you're dealing with layers and things like that. Now, the storage you use will, a lot of times people use a SSD as a temporary storage, like projects that you're currently working on, and that's a wise use of storage because video obviously takes up a lot of space. Kind of relying only on SSDs can be expensive. So what I'd recommend is getting like a terabyte SSD drive, which you can get less than $100 now. It's really good. Get a terabyte drive, you know, load up Adobe on there, your boot drive, all that. Just get everything nice and snappy and quick, and then have your temporary files there that you work with, and then back everything up on a much larger rotational drive. Especially around the 7,200 RPM range, because then they're just faster. I mean, hard drives are eventually going to go away. At least consumer level rotational drives will eventually go away, but right now they're cheap enough still that mass storage is still useful on them. Now, when moving up to 4K editing, 16 gigabytes of RAM will only get you so far for smaller videos. I do edit in 4K, and I had 16 gigabytes of RAM for a little bit, and it didn't work well. I got a lot of crashes. The space would get taken up too much, so you're gonna want to do 32 gigabytes, if not 64, depending on like if you're working on documentaries or anything that's, you know, substantially long. You're going to want to go for a lot more memory, and everything else still applies. I mean, definitely at least 6 or 8 cores once you're dealing with 4K. It'll save you a lot of time. You're not going to get as many crashes, and you're going to not have to wait hours to render out your videos. So when dealing with 4K, 6 to 8 cores, as high as clocked as you can. Clock speeds, you're always going to want to try to go for as high as you can. Within reason, with price to performance. Right now, the Ryzen 3000 series have proven to be the best bang for buck. Ryzen has really taken over the CPU world, more so than Intel. And yeah, I just, you know, the 3600 or the 3700, great options on a pretty good price. I definitely would recommend going that direction. Now, as far as the brand of graphics card, I want to go back to the graphics card real quick. When dealing with Premiere specifically, they seem to have a preference over Nvidia, where they enable CUDA cores, and it goes faster. So if you're going to be using Nvidia, if you're going to be using Adobe Premiere, I would go the Nvidia route just for those reasons, because that'll be a nice little boost. And even if you're dealing with lower end Nvidia cards, it'll still be fine. AMD tends to be a little bit more generous when it comes to video RAM, which has great uses in the 3D space, which I'll get to in a little bit. But for video encoding, Nvidia with the H.624, I always mess up once I say the dot. Yeah, that encoding is Nvidia preferred. It's not that it won't work on AMD, it's just if you're looking for a little bit of an edge and you're really just trying to decide between the two, Nvidia seems to have that right now. I have AMD. I'm not being, I'm not playing favorites or anything. That's just a little bit of a tip I wanted to give you. As far as Photoshop and Lightroom are concerned, the funny thing is you can run these on mobile now. Like if you have an iPad, you can run it just fine. But I've seen a lot of comments in previous videos talking about mass exports and things like that, people complaining about it. And there is a realm of truth. If you're going to be doing a lot of heavy edits and you're going to be working with a lot of files at once, there are tips I can give you as far as what you can expect. 4 cores or more is fine. CPU wise, it's not usually that intensive. If you are batching like tons of files all at once, and a lot, like that's your main job, is to edit photos and to export constantly, the bigger the CPU, the better in that case. But say you're just a photographer, not just a photographer, but you're a professional photographer and you're only dealing with your own edits, really it's not going to be that much of a difficulty dealing with just 4 cores. I mean, you can go more, but just don't feel the pressure to go higher unless you're dealing with like heavy workloads, or maybe massive file sizes. So for that big fast RAM, you can do 8, but 8 is starting to get phased out. 8 is starting to not be enough for a lot of workloads in the professional field. Windows tends to take more and more now. So 8 is okay, but I would definitely recommend going a little bit higher, go to 16. When working with very large files, I did a 10,000 by 10,000 pixel drawing, which is one of the uses for Photoshop. Is if you're an artist, I don't want to make this only about photographers. For doing artwork, when I had 8 gigabytes, the RAM was struggling a lot of the times, handling file sizes that were that big, especially when scaling around. And that also has to do with RAM speed and CPU, but the fact remains, larger files, and if you have multiple open, get more RAM. And I think the same applies, getting a really fast NVMe drive as your storage, or just even a SATA SSD is going to be miles better than a rotational drive, but always have a rotational drive as a mass backup for your files once you're done with them, because photographers take a lot of pictures and they get stored places. Need to stay. You keep an archive. Now, if you're using Lightroom as your storage, your storage library, keep that all on a larger NVMe, because then you can store more there, and then it'll be easier to archive things. The GPU, when it comes to this, isn't going to matter as much. Same rules apply. Get something that's modern, but it doesn't have to be at the highest end. Like a 1650 Super is still going to be just as good for this. I think the rules still apply that they do to the video editing. However, a little bit less, because in Photoshop, even though it's pictures, your video card isn't going to be used as much as your CPU and your RAM. For 3D modeling, this is going to be the most expensive out of any creative field that you can do, because, well, it's just much more difficult to work with. So you're going to want to do at least 8 cores. I mean, the 3600 could be arguably feasible, but if we're talking about more intensive stuff, now if you're doing light 3D modeling, the 3600 will be fine. Ryzen 3600 is what I should specify. That'll be fine. But 8 cores or more, and by more I mean even 16 cores or 28 cores, if you're getting into more of the Threadripper categories or the Xeon categories. If you're doing really large files in large environments, then time is money. And in 3D modeling, that is the case, because it is a very time-heavy activity. And the faster you can get your workloads out, the quicker you can get paid. So I think it's a very good argument to make to get a larger CPU. And your CPU, again, is going to be doing a lot of the bulk of the work. Now, as far as CAD is concerned, your video card will be very important. I'm going to break this up a little bit. So if you're doing photogrammetry, where you take series of photos of an object or an environment and then render it into 3D space, a lot of softwares prefer to use CUDA cores, which means Nvidia. So keep that in mind and check which one. Now, I believe it was Metashape from Agisoft. They allow AMD rendering. So that's fine, but you do have to pay for the license for the program. Now, if you're using Mesh Lab, I forget what they changed the name to, the open source one, the free version. Now, if you're just building a computer and you want to do photogrammetry and you want to have a good program that does it for free, Mesh does that, but they require CUDA cores, so make sure you look into an Nvidia card. When it comes to 3D modeling, the bigger the graphics card you can get, the better. Not only just for the video RAM, which is extremely important, but for the speed of it as well. AMD, when dealing with CAD and normal 3D applications, it seems to have a little bit of an advantage over Nvidia at times, because again, they're a little bit more generous with their video RAM, and they just tend to be more efficient sometimes. It really depends, but I'd look into it because 3D space is such a big thing. It could be CAD that you're working on, engineering 3D. It could be movie scenes. It could be photogrammetry. There's 3D work is not one-dimensional, obviously. I crack myself up. But there's a lot of different applications for it, so it really depends whether you're going to go AMD or Nvidia. But yeah, go all out with that. It's going to be the more expensive of the builds that you could possibly make. But yeah, I hope this shows at least a little bit in the differences in what you want to focus on, depending on what you're going to do and what is the ideal workflow PC workstation, the ideal workstations you want to be shooting for and the components therein. I'm pretty sure I covered everything as best as I can, but I know that there are a lot of specific use cases. So if you have questions, feel free to comment below. In the description, I'm going to have a large parts list of different things that might be helpful to you. I didn't talk about screens because that's so subjective when it comes to media. The refresh rate doesn't really matter. It's more about color accuracy and field of view and stuff like that. So, you know, anything with 100% Adobe sRGB or whatever is going to be fine. IPS is usually what you'd want to aim for, but VA is fine too. High resolutions, I mean, you know, get a good deal on that. Maybe I'll throw another one in below, but that's all I have to say about that. So, again, if you have questions, feel free to ask me below. I've done a little bit in all of these fields, so I'm not just blowing smoke. I know the workspaces well enough. So, yeah. How do you wrap up videos again? And this is always the weirdest part.